I'll just start.
And then
I'll just
call
start.
the first panel.
The mics are on? Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the Senate Select Committee on Air Quality. I am State Senator Ted Lieu, and here with me is my good friend, LA City Councilmember Bill Rosendahl. And first, some housekeeping measures. The restrooms are behind you to the right. There's coffee and cookies in the back as well. So let me tell you about why I'm doing a hearing on this issue. I first got involved when I was actually running for assembly, and we were walking precincts around Santa Monica Airport, and I was knocking on doors, and I knocked on this one door, and this gentleman came up, and he figured out what I was doing, and he said, hang on a second. So he went back, and then, about 25 seconds later, he came and gave me this black ball. And so I'm looking at this black ball, and I said to him, what is it? And he goes, it's an orange. And it's an orange that was on his tree that was all covered by black soot from this airport. And then about an hour later, I had to stop walking precincts because I felt nauseous from doing so. And it just occurred to me at that time that this was not right, that there was something going on here that I think we needed to let the public know about and have some studies done. So since that time, several studies have now been done. 2 by South Coast AQMD, 1 from UCLA. There's one that, although not specifically on Santa Monica Airport, was done on airports in North Carolina, from which you'll hear a presentation tonight. And when you look at these studies and you listen to experts, you're going to listen from the experts. And I think when you hear from these experts, you will get a sense that there is a troubling picture of the pollutants that the residents around this airport are breathing in. And so one of the purposes of this hearing is to put out these studies for the public to examine, to let experts be questioned, for you to ask questions, and we will have public testimony at the end of the hearing. And in addition, we'll have activists as well as those who are on the other side of this issue. Feel free to talk as well. So let me first now turn to my great colleague, Bill Rosendahl, for comments.
Thank you very much, Senator. I have the similar initial experience when I was a candidate for office, which was in 2004. The election was in 2005. I walked the neighborhood here that is right in the back of the airport. My God, my eyes watered, my throat burned, and I was really, really concerned by the toxicity that I was experiencing from idling jets with no buffer zone coming into my lungs. It got me quite concerned about a serious health issue. Obviously, I have a long history with this airport. I've lived in this part of the city for a long time. And at one point, I owned a home on North of Rose there for 5 years, a nice house. And all of a sudden, I realized I had planes taking off right in front of and going over my house constantly. I walked 50 yards up and I was in Santa Monica and no planes were going over there. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew all the electeds in Santa Monica because I was a guy who managed a cable conglomerate and had a big television show, and they all had been on my show. And I was just beyond belief upset that all takeoffs, all landings, and all toxicity went to Los Angeles, not to Santa Monica, and yet it's their airport. So I fought it at a level as a citizen, and then when I became an elected official, they had redistricted the 11th district, and I ended up having Santa Monica as a small town in the heart of my district. And all of a sudden, it became a reality that all of Los Angeles, that embraces the entire city of Santa Monica, have an impact with the airport. And I'm not going to go into all the history of all the activities and all of the issues we've worked out and all of the discussions my city has had and some of my colleagues, but today is very historic. When you have a state Senate committee on air quality, air pollution basics in Santa Monica Airport, one created in Sacramento, that is on an assignment here to ask questions, and have testimony. I can't tell you how appreciative I am of seeing the democracy in action. Where this will take things and how things will unfold, we'll see over the years ahead. People know my position. I'm very clear on it. I want to know whatever we can do by 2015 to shut the airport down. That's where I'm at. If you don't like it, that's your business. You're entitled to your position. My hope is, as the process unveils itself and as the testimony explains, it becomes so compelling that the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate and the President of the United States, as the policymakers, make a policy decision that shuts it down in 2015. So that's my bias. That's where I'm coming from. I'm thrilled to see the state senator here holding a public hearing for testimony on the subject of air quality and the toxicity of what we're experiencing as residents in Santa Monica and residents in the city of Los Angeles. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me speak.
So we're going to call Dr. Fine up here to testify. And the way this hearing will work is we'll start more general, sort of about air pollution, and then we'll go to some very specific studies just on Santa Monica Airport. And so, Dr. Fine, if you want to come up and testify, that'd be great. And one more housekeeping measure. We also will take electronic comments as well. So if any of you want to submit your comments electronically, you can go to air.senate.ca.gov and submit your comments. And also all these studies are on that website as well if you want to link to them and read them for yourself. So Dr. Fine, why don't you go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Liu. I was asked tonight to give a little bit on air quality basics, kind of an air quality 101 course. I'll try to get through it quickly, but I'll try to keep it simple so we can all be on the same page when we talk about the other issues around Santa Monica Airport. Go ahead. So first, again, my name is Philip Fine, and I'm a Planning and Rules Manager at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And when it comes to air quality, as far as the agencies that oversee air quality, it's a multi-tiered system. We have the federal U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In the state of California, we have the California Air Resources Board, and then locally, the agency I work for is the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And each tier has different responsibilities when it comes to air quality regulation, control, and cleaning the air. Very quickly, the US EPA sets standards that for ambient air, the concentrations in the air that are deemed to be safe or not safe, and it's up to the states to meet those standards by passing rules and regulations to lower the emissions. In the state of California, some of the authority for regulating those emissions when it comes to stationary sources, which are things like factories, refineries, industrial facilities, has been delegated to the local districts, again, like the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Next slide. So our jurisdiction is basically a four-county area. It includes all of Orange County and the most populated areas of LA, San Bernardino, and Riverside County. But this is the largest local district in the country. It's about 10,000 square miles. We cover 17 million residents, which is probably 1 out of every 18 or 19 people in the country. Includes millions of gasoline vehicles, hundreds of thousands of diesel trucks, and are the biggest port in the country at Long Beach and Los Angeles. Next slide. So why do we have bad air quality in Southern California? You've probably all heard that we do still have very poor air quality. It's a combination of a lot of emissions and a lot of sources, including the trucks and the ships, the cars, the planes, as well as the factories and refineries that we have. But it's also an unfortunate situation geographically that the air pollution gets trapped near the ground under something called an inversion layer. Everyone knows that hot air rises, cool air would stay towards the ground, but when we have an inversion layer with warmer air higher, it basically traps the pollution near the ground, and that's why we have some of the worst air quality in the nation. This isn't just a picture or a theoretical. If you click it, this actually happens, and when you fly in to LA in a plane, you actually see that inversion layer as you're coming in. And you can see this is a pretty smoggy day. Next slide. So just some key air pollution terms. There's basically, you can divide air quality problems into 3 scales. We have global issues when it comes to climate change and greenhouse gases. We have regional air quality issues, which affect areas that are tens to hundreds of miles wide. And then we have local air quality issues, which are those issues that you run into when you live or work very close to a source, up to a mile, sometimes a few hundred feet or a few hundred meters. And each of these scales of pollution air quality problems are handled in very different ways. There is some overlap in the types of pollutants, but they're generally regulated and handled in very different ways. There are many sources of pollution, and we divide those into 3 broad areas. We have the stationary sources I mentioned, which are industrial facilities, power plants, refineries, etc. We have area sources, which are spread out even further, things like burning wood in your fireplace, the use of consumer products, agriculture. Those are very typical area sources. And then we have the mobile sources, which are cars, trucks, trains, planes, and ships. In general, as a local agency, we have jurisdiction over those stationary sources and some of the area sources, but we do not have jurisdiction over the mobile sources. The regulation of those sources, which cause the majority of our problems, lie with the state or the federal government. Go back one, sorry. And then there's when these pollutants are emitted from those sources, we can divide those kind of into 2 broad categories. There's certain pollutants that are emitted directly from the source, like from the tailpipe, from a smokestack, and we call those primary emissions. Things like lead, which I'll talk about, particulate matter, air toxics, carbon monoxide, are those directly emitted. Then there's something called secondary pollution, which are certain things are emitted from the tailpipe, and then as they exist in the atmosphere, as they interact with sunlight, as they are transported across long distances and spend time in the air, they undergo chemical reactions and are actually transformed into pollutants that are also harmful. And those things are the 2 typical ones, and the ones that we are not meeting federal standards for are ozone and particulate matter. Ozone, again, is, you've heard of the ozone layer problem. Ozone in the stratosphere is actually helpful. That is something that protects us from the harmful rays from the sun, the UV rays. But ozone at ground level is actually is a harmful pollutant that we need to lower in order to protect our public health. Next slide. So these key air pollutants, as I mentioned, there's 6 air pollutants that EPA considers what they known as criteria pollutants. You can give it another click. So carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, lead, ozone, and particulate matter. These are the 6 criteria pollutants. The basin is in attainment for the first 3 there. We're in non-attainment for the last 3. The 2 ones we have to work very hard to correct are the particulate matter, PM10 and PM2.5, and I'll explain what those mean, as well as ozone. Next slide. In addition to those criteria pollutants, we also want to protect the public from a category of pollutants called air toxics. And these are specific chemicals in some cases. It also includes lead, even though it's also a criteria pollutant. Certain metals in the air, a lot of organic gases we call volatile organic compounds. And the biggest one is diesel particulate matter, which is that black soot you see coming out of diesel trucks. In addition to air toxics, we're also involved in the greenhouse gases that are involved in climate change. And then finally, an emerging issue for us is something known as ultrafine particles. And again, this is an issue at the Santa Monica Airport. These are currently unregulated, but there's a growing body of scientific research that suggests that these particles have their own toxicity and may be more toxic than what is currently regulated under what's known as particulate matter. Next slide. So just some kind of depictions of how ozone is formed, and you can click through this quickly. Ozone is formed from these precursors. The VOCs, which are the volatile organic compounds, come from consumer products. NOx, nitrogen dioxides, come from trucks. Factories can emit both of those, and cars can also emit both of those, and it all goes into the air. It gets cooked by the sunlight, keep clicking, and over time, click, 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 and eventually it forms ozone. And that gets transported long distances and generally affects the inland areas of the South Coast Basin. Particulate matter similarly undergoes an atmospheric process. It comes from a variety of sources, whether it's on-road sources, factories. Dust also contributes in sea salt. These go into the air, keep clicking, and it also, so those are the primary emissions of particulate matter, but there's also all these other gases that react in the sunlight and add to the particulate matter problem over time. And those form new particles, they grow those particles, and then we end up with particulate matter. Now, particulate matter is regulated based on its size, and what I have here is a picture of if you look at that big gray kind of quarter pie there, that is a cross-section of a human hair. Huh. So that's about what we call 60 microns in diameter. A micron is a thousandth of a millimeter. So the particles we're talking about are very small. 10 microns or less is the big yellow one, and that is regulated by the EPA. The orange one is what we call PM 2.5, also regulated by the EPA. But the ultrafine particle, which you can barely see as a tiny red dot, we're calling it PM 0.1, is what is known as ultrafine particles, very, very small particles. These particles can travel into your lungs, enter across the cell walls, get into your cells, and travel throughout your body. And again, there's some emerging evidence that these are harmful beyond the effects that are known for the larger PM particles. Next slide. So where are we now as far as air quality in the basin? This is an example of ozone showing the number of days we exceeded or were above the federal standard. And back in the early 90s, we were exceeding, over 100 times a day. And things have gotten a lot better over time. You can see the number of days we had a problem each year has dropped significantly. And this is at the time where we had very large population growth. So in spite of that growth, we've had great air quality improvements, mostly due to technological advances in motor vehicle emissions, as well as a pretty stringent regulatory program on the stationary sources. But what you also see here is there's, as the EPA looks at the health evidence, that they keep tightening the standard. So as we get better and better, say on that old standard, which is the blue line, they keep making the standard tighter, which means we exceed on more days. So if you look at that top line, that's the newest standard from 2008. And even though it is improving, we still have a long way to go with still over 100 days over the standard. So one distinction I want to make that's important is regional pollution problems versus local pollution problems. So a regional pollutant, like PM or ozone, is generally formed in the air and over hours and days and traveling miles in the air, transported by the wind. Reactions occur because of the sun. Most of these particles or ozone are formed in the air. There are some primary particles, but most of it is what's known as secondary. So these types of pollutants affect large areas and are regulated in a very specific way, but it's a different type of regulation when you have these local air pollution problems like Santa Monica Airport. Next slide. If you see this animation, you'll see how ozone builds up in the basin, and oops, maybe that animation isn't going to work. In any case, if this was working, you'd see over the course of the day how the ozone levels build up inland over Riverside, San Bernardino. They generally don't affect the west side because the pollutants haven't had time to react in the air. So you see it building up in the afternoon with the sunlight over those inland areas, Riverside, San Bernardino, Fontana. Next slide. There was an animation there. Anyway, so the mobile, when we look at what sources are causing the problem, whether it's PM, whether it's ozone, and even whether it's air toxics, generally over 80 to 90% of the problem comes from mobile sources, and those are sources that at least the local district doesn't have much jurisdiction over. So it's a challenge for us to solve some of these problems when we have limited jurisdiction over the sources causing the problem. Next slide. Now, as opposed to those regional pollutants, when you live close to a source, whether it's an airport, a factory, a freeway, you have a local impact that occurs on, could be 100 meters or a few hundred feet, can extend out to a mile or so. There were a lot of seminal studies done at UCLA on how living next to a roadway increases your exposure to certain pollutants, such as ultrafine particles, black carbon, which is an indicator of diesel particulate, and the closer you are to the freeway, the much higher your concentrations are. So again, whether you live next to a freeway or a factory, proximity matters. On the bottom there is how we do the kind of modeling to show that on kind of a neighborhood scale, the closer you are to a source, the more you are impacted. The types of pollutants that are like this local pollution tend to be called air toxics. However, lead is one of them as well. Ultrafine PM works in this way as well. Next slide. So where do air toxics come from? I mentioned that, click the next, the one that is the most important for us is diesel particulate matter. If you look at the black soot coming out of diesel trucks, that's a very toxic substance as determined by the state of California. It kind of has this look on the right there if you look at it under a microscope. And this really drives our cancer risk from air pollution in the basin. There are other toxic chemicals that are air toxics. A lot of those organic gases, such as benzene, toluene, a lot of those come from mobile sources. Specific metals, such as lead, are also air toxics. And these are the things that kind of act on that local scale and are controlled at the source rather than controlled by setting a standard for ambient air. Next slide. So just to demonstrate how diesel particulate is one of our major problems, this is from a periodic study we do every 4 to 6 years to look at air toxics throughout the basin. We do a lot of measurements and we do a lot of models that predict what the exposure is and the cancer risk. So this is our final cancer risk map, and you can see that the cancer risk from air toxics in the basin can get as high as 1,000 in a million risk for cancer, or maybe up to 2,000 in a million in some areas. You can also see how that risk follows the busy roadways and freeways, and in particular the cargo transport routes from the ports are really what drives a lot of this cancer risk because of the diesel trucks, because of the diesel locomotives, and because of the ships. If we take the cancer risk out of this map, next slide, you see the map gets a lot cleaner. Most of the cancer risk goes away. So 80 to 90% of our cancer risk comes from diesel particulate matter. That dot is LAX, and it's a concentrated, there is a lot of activity there on some of the VOCs. That's why it pops up there. But the cancer risk is less than what you'd get with diesel. Next slide. So what are the health impacts of air pollution? And this is not even including air toxics. This is just from PM and in particular, and ozone is similar. We have over 5,000 premature deaths a year from elevated pollution, air pollution in Southern California. And there's a lot of other health impacts besides those premature deaths, including hundreds of thousands of lost work and school days, hospitalizations, the development of asthma and exacerbation of asthma and other respiratory illnesses, the onset of acute bronchitis, and again, the cancer risk that can come from the diesel particulates, other air toxics, and some of the criteria pollutants as well. So with that, I hope that's a good background, and I don't know how we're going to handle questions, but maybe later.
Thank you for that presentation. So I have a few questions for you. Ultrafine particles, who regulates?
Nobody at this point. The only ultrafine regulations are just beginning to take effect in Europe, tailpipe standards for ultrafine particles in Europe.
Okay. And is it possible to say that because of the way the South Coast Basin is constituted, that any pollutant effects from Santa Monica Airport would be somewhat magnified because of the inversion layer that you mentioned and the other geographic constraints that we have here?
In Santa Monica, in general, the further you are to the west in the basin, the further you are to the coast, the better your air quality, especially for those regional pollutants. But when you talk about local pollution, it's just how close you are to a particular source. Okay. It doesn't matter whether you live inland or outland. So that's why it's important to draw that distinction. For PM, for ozone, you expect the high levels inland after they've had time in the air to react. For local pollution, doesn't matter you're on the west side, in the Inland Empire, it just matters how close you are to a freeway, an airport, a particular factory, and as you move away, the concentrations drop dramatically. At Santa Monica Airport, that's the situation for ultrafine particles.
Got it. Thank you.
And when you talk about ultrafine particles, you said it's relatively new. Explain how you describe it to be separate from the others? What is it?
Well, I don't know if Professor Foynes is here yet to talk about the health effects. You know, the way EPA sets the criteria pollutant standards is based on hundreds, if not thousands, of studies, epidemiological studies, which look at large populations and long-term exposure and deciding what that, looking at the statistics and trying to tease out a health effect out of that. And there's just not enough information on ultrafines on the epidemiology side yet for EPA to set those types of standards. On the toxicology side, there's been a lot more studies done on ultrafines that suggest they have a higher toxicity. But there's still a lot of unanswered questions about how you regulate, how you measure them. It's still an emerging area in many respects.
When a plane, the jets, which are relatively new, 15, 18 years there, when they're idling, and the westerlies, that great wind, takes it very close, just across a street, are those kinds of ultrafine particles found within the idling jet? Or what particles do you find with an idling jet that might be of interest or of safety or health concerns?
And in my later presentation, when I talk about our studies, I'll get into that a little bit more. But we do know from not only Santa Monica Airport studies, but also studies at other airports, even LAX, that the numbers of ultrafine particles coming out of jets are very, very high. They're very efficient ultrafine particle generators. You can get the typical concentration of ultrafine particles in air, if you went outside right now, might be 5 to 10,000 particles in a sugar cube. Yeah. If you're anywhere near a jet, that can get up to 1 to 5 million. So it's a very efficient generator of ultrafine particles. There haven't been a lot of studies on the relative health impacts of ultrafines from jets versus ultrafines from diesel trucks versus ultrafines from cars. So these are still kind of unanswered questions. But yeah, we have seen very high levels in that neighborhood, and it does travel into the nearby houses from the runway.
I just want to make a comment in general about the diesel, which we agree with you 100%. In the city of Los Angeles this morning, I held a press conference where we announced that all of our commuter express buses, which go through a whole large region, are now all CNG. We got rid of the diesel completely, and we changed the fleet. We brought in 85 new buses today, and we're off of the diesel. So more diesel get rid of. That overall picture be important.
Right.
Thank you.
And that is why Bill Rosendahl is one of the best elected officials I've ever had the opportunity to work with.
Remember, this is your city and your channel, Channel 35. Thank you.
All right. So Dr. Foynes is in our lovely traffic. Has he gotten here yet? If he hasn't, we're going to start with Dr. Shahram Yazdani. And Dr. Fine, if you want to just stay there, that'd be great. Okay. And Dr. Yazdani is going to talk about how some of these pollutants affect children. Go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Shahram Yazdani, one of the faculty at UCLA in the Department of Pediatrics. In February 2010, for a number of reasons, we decided to study the impact of health pollutants from Santa Monica Airport on the community. But as pediatricians, we obviously focus mostly on its effect on children and pregnant women. And we're delighted that the community actually cares about children and pregnant women. We believe what affects them will affect all of us, and it's not particular to them. It's a little bit important to understand how we did this. This is basically based on existing scientific data, and some of the sources seen there are all the most important scientific resources we have available to us as physicians and scientists. We also looked at some of the public standards and regulations and guidelines that may be relevant to airport planning and health. To make a second part of that, which we will not go so much into today, that's the recommendation for mitigating the problem. If the panel's interested, we can certainly go into that. Next slide, please. So we wanted to focus on what community we'll look at. This is an aerial picture of the Santa Monica Airport, and it's What's striking about this airport is that it's within the heart of the community, which is very highly populated. If you look at just the Northwest L, where it seems to be greatly affected, and it's downwind from the airport, just in the 2-mile radius, you have 150,000 residents. And within that, again, from pediatric point of view, we see a very large population registered preschools, elementary schools, middle schools, colleges, which, you know, the population of children or young adults who spend time in these areas is quite prolonged. It's for a big part of their life they spend time in these places, learning centers. We also found there are a lot of daycares that are out of homes, and we actually don't know how many children are in those places. There are 6 parks. Interestingly, 2 of them are right on the border of the airport. There's no buffer between the 2. Next. So obviously, takeoff and landing are probably in particular a significant problem, and they seem to have elevated levels of a number of problems. I think we talked very nicely about what are some of these things, and I'll briefly go over them and how do they really affect you biologically and physiologically. But it's important to realize carbon black is one of those things, and we're going to go into these in detail. But one of the things these carbon black does, or black carbon, depending on what you call them, they cause respiratory and cardiovascular problems. Asthma is one of the more obvious ones, but they do also cause sudden death. They do cause irreversible lung damage in children, and they do have carcinogenic effect, which we'll see how. Ultrafine particles that seem to be more and more, part of the scientific community's studies. There is a lot on rodent models, but there is some evidence that it does affect children and adults as well, and it does cause increased inflammation in the lungs. And increased inflammation is responsible for a lot of problems, from cardiovascular problems to long-term risk factor for cancer. Next one, please. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons is one of those big problems that we see from incomplete combustion of some of these fuels. And basically, in addition to the fact that they have carcinogenic effect, they do disrupt hormonal balance in adults, and especially reproductive system in pregnant women. And they do seem to lower IQ in children to a point where it's not just statistically significant, it's actually clinically relevant. Jet noise. Jet noise is one of those things that everybody thinks of as kind of a nuisance, and you may, get used to it or not. But in fact, it has physiologic effect. Some of the physiologic effect we didn't bring up in this report simply because it's still being studied. But some of the things we mentioned here are well studied and well established. And the biggest problem is that there's no buffer zone. I think that's the theme that keeps coming up in all these discussions. Next one, please. So just to go not so much into the chemistry of these things, but what we concentrated on was carbon black, ultrafine, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And these are just simple depictions of what you see there. Next one. So carbon black. It's interesting to understand, in children, the lungs simply grow very rapidly in the first 18 years of life, and then they stop. So what you have at 18 years is it. Anything you do after that, from surgery to severe infections and cancer, they can simply decrease lung capacity. When you arrest lung capacity up until age 18, that simply means by the time you're 18, everything else will simply degrade from then on. And if you don't have a very good reserve, you don't have a very good chance of longevity and resisting disease later on in life. So this seems to have a big effect on children. Sudden death, particularly in those with history of cardiac disease and a heart attack. Everyone thinks of cardiac disease as something you get with old age. There are a large number of children with congenital heart disease post-transplant. This is a community where we attract a lot of those children from all over. They get their care at UCLA, and therefore they're at high risk if they live in this community. DNA methylation is an important factor, and I think that's one of the things I want to highlight here. How does carbon black cause problem? We don't quite know why it decreases what's called DNA methylation, but DNA, just because its structure is intact, that doesn't mean that it does what it's supposed to do. How it's methylated seems to make a difference in the physiologic effects we see. The cardiac disease and cancer in those patients, if you look at them, they seem to have decreased DNA methylation. Now, what causes that? There are a number of things, from radiation to other things, but carbon black seems to be very efficient in doing that as well. These, unfortunately, can we go back? Unfortunately, what's a little bit scary about carbon black is that if your children, your offspring, are never exposed to any of this carbon black, and if their parents are exposed, these children will have the same effect or similar effect as their parents, even though they were never exposed to diesel. And that seems to be because they bind themselves to the cells, DNA of the cells that generate sperms. And also, when you're born as a woman, the number of eggs that you carry simply decrease throughout life. But what your child that you deliver at age 20 versus 40 versus thereon, it's all from the cells that you were born with. So if you were exposed at any point to any of these things, your egg will carry the same footprint of that carbon black to the next generation. What happens to the generation after that, we don't know, but we do see the same risk factors for cancer in children who were never exposed, but their parents were exposed. And that's really the striking thing about carbon black. Next one, please. Ultrafine particle, I think there's a lot of discussion about these things. I do want to point out it does cause atherosclerosis. It does seem to affect those cell walls of the arteries. When you have atherosclerosis, if you look at these children or you look at young adults who were exposed, they look as if they were aged. And that puts them at risk for these blood vessels suddenly bursting and causing myocardial attacks and strokes. And that's how you see some premature death in those who are exposed to these things. Everybody hears about oxidative effect. Oxidative effect, from pomegranate to everything else they sell us, it's supposed to be antioxidant. Well, nothing will compete with these ultrafine particles. They're very oxidative. They cause just across the board cell damage and cell aging, or what mimics cell aging, and those who were exposed. Next one, please. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons have a number of problems, from headaches to neurologic effects. You see a number of things. What we highlighted here is the fact that, again, they love your DNA. They're very efficient at transferring it across the cell wall, transferring along the nucleus wall, and binding themselves to the DNA. As a effect of that, they're genotoxic. And again, I want to emphasize, you are your genes. Once you affect those, the blueprint for every cell, which constitutes the rest of the body, is really very much affected by all this. The genotoxic effect, cancer is simply one of those things. Endocrine disruptors, it affects fetal growth, and because of the fact that it decreases fetal growth, whether it's the brain or the heart or the rest of the body, it puts you at risk for having mental retardation. And just to get some numbers here, those who were exposed are 3 times more likely to have any kind of moderate mental retardation than those who were not. What's interesting about it is that we monitor children in the first 3 to 5 years of life very closely. You don't see that effect in the year number 1 or number 2. But when you look at them in the year number 3, you see that. Why is that? It's because in the first 2 years of life, you're really looking at gross motor, fine motor, language. But when you get to cognitive function, when you get to 3 and above, and you're looking at their cognitive function, they seem to be somewhat behind. And it seems to function, and it seems to affect the higher functions of the brain. Next one, please. I want to spend a little bit of time on noise. The current threshold of 65 decibels is really a day and night average sound level. But in between all these things, whenever a jet takes off, the sound level goes up to 95 or even above that. Some of these tend to be even noisier than that. The question is, do you get any kind of effect from these just sudden bursts of noise and then when it goes down? Well, if you even go down 10 points at 85 decibels, you can see hearing loss. So repeated exposure to 85 decibels or above, even if it's intermittent, could cause problem. For every 5 decibels increase in noise in children in classrooms, you see them falling up to 2 months behind in a reading. So noisy schools tend to have lower performance than than schools that are not so noisy. And this is well studied in England and somewhat in the US as well. And they seem to affect both short and long-term memory across the board, in small children, in adults, and in geriatric as well. I think the next one is, this is basically, I don't know how well you can see it from the back of the room. It basically summarizes what we see, and it's coming from a Mac to a PC, so it's a little bit off. But basically, what you're seeing is the effects of these things. The two major effects are exposure to noise and chemicals. And each one of those chemicals which have some of those effects, these are highlights of those effects. They're subtle effects that are not so well studied, and we did not include in our report. And the next slide, I think, just summarizes people who are involved in creating these. 3 of our faculty, and this is a group from a community health and advocacy track, which is part of UCLA residency. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you. I have to say, I think that was one of the most troubling studies I've ever seen.
Yes.
And I think the study speaks for itself. So, Councilmember Rosendahl, do you have any questions?
Just curious about the population of people you interacted with, the geography you covered, the basic empirical data that gave you these conclusions.
Again, this data is based on all existing information as to how these chemicals typically react. This is not a study of particular problem within the community. That's a different study that we're not presenting here at this time. But yes, there's evidence that within this community, you're seeing the carcinogenic effect in children.
Thank you.
By the way, I just want to highlight some of the things in this study, in the executive summary. I think you do state flat out that the proximity of Santa Monica Airport to schools, daycare centers, and parks, in addition to residential homes, poses great exposure risks to children and to their families. And I assume, how was this study funded?
This study was funded by UCLA.
Okay.
Most of the people who work here didn't work on a grant.
So for folks who don't think there's any issue here, you may just want to look at this study again. So we're going to call up, if you could stay there, that'd be great. Call up next Dr. John Froines, who's also from UCLA.
You can stay.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah. We're worried about the 30 to 40 stitches that are in my knee, and we don't want to tear out the stitching. So pardon me for being so clumsy here. I'm going to talk about some findings. I direct the Southern California Particle Center at UCLA, and we've been in existence now going on 13 years. And so I'm going to just highlight some of this. We have probably 400 papers, and so that we have a lot. So that if there was ever a time to talk for an hour, or go into more detail, I'd be very happy to do it. So don't hesitate to ask if I can be of assistance in the future. So I'm going to talk about some of our research findings. I think that Phil Fine has told you about ultrafine, so I'm going to assume knowledge on the part of the audience. Basically, our particle center, our objective is to determine the basis for health effects from ambient particulate matter and vapors, and I'll emphasize vapors because it's not been given attention. Mobile sources has been our major foci. We've done railroad studies. We've done a study at LAX, which I'll mention. When we have, of course, dealt with diesel and with vehicles. We want to determine the chemical and physical properties. We want to link those chemical and physical properties with adverse health effects, and we've wanted to define the mechanistic features of illness and disease from air pollution. Next slide. Now I just want to point out I don't know what Phil did, but I want to point out some interesting features. I'm going to come back to this later. Notice let's assume this is a diesel particle, an ultrafine diesel particle. And what you see is the soot core, which everybody's familiar with, but you should also notice the adsorbed toxics, which are in the green around the soot core, and look at the condensed phase toxics, that is semi-volatile materials that condense from being hot and becoming cooler. Deepest region of the lung. And next slide. And they cause alveolar inflammation. That alveolar inflammation produces immunologic responses. Those immunologic responses then move to the heart, move to other parts of the lung, move to the brain, move around the body, and cause alveolar inflammation. Alveolar inflammation's partially responsible, if not wholly responsible, for heart attacks, responsible for asthma, and so on and so forth. So you can see the brain uptake, you can see the deep part of the lung uptake, and gives you a sense of why these particles are toxic, because if they're entering cells all the way through the lungs, they are then going to produce immunologic responses that cause inflammatory processes. Next slide. Now, this is, if you take an animal, a mouse, and you treat them with a protein called OVA, what they do is that sensitizes the animal so that the animal becomes allergic. But if you then take the OVA and ultrafine particles, look what's happening on the top slide. I've been talking about inflammation, and I don't think I have to push the point, but look at the level of inflammation in those lungs. You have mucose substances in the second that are formed. Those are polysaccharides. Those are big, long sugars. And in the bottom, you have white blood cells that have been formed. So what happens is, if you think of a child who's sensitive to asthma, and so that they are in the category of people who have been exposed to the OVA, if this makes sense to you, if you take sensitized, susceptible people, and then you add ultrafine particles, you are going to catalytically increase the impact, and therefore this is a slide which we think emphasizes the potential for asthma. Next slide. So ultrafine particles are capable to enhance the primary allergic sensitization response to experimental allergens, and inhalation of real-life ultrafine particles leads to profound allergic inflammation deep in the lung in the previously sensitized animals. So this shows you the connection between susceptibility on the one hand and disease production on the other. All right, here's a mouse study we did with the ApoE mouse, and I won't go into the details. We gave them non-exposed air, we gave them filtered air, we gave them fine particles at PM 2.5, and we gave them ultrafine particles. Next slide. And if you look at these slides, look at the ones with the ultrafine particles. Look at these are aortic lesions. These are inflammatory lesions in the aorta, and there's a dramatic difference between the fine particles and the ultrafine particles, and there's a vast difference with the filtered air. So that when you actually quantitate this, next slide, keep going, you can see that the ultrafine particles lead to the most massive the most massive aortic lesions, and there are fewer with the rest. And so that's an example of ultrafine's relationship to heart attacks. We've looked at the issue of what we call oxidation of low-density cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, and that occurs, and that's part of the atherosclerotic, the heart disease, cardiovascular problem. But these are real results in animals that the aortic lesions were highly sensitive to the ultrafine particles. So we have also seen changes in humans and senior citizens with respect to blood pressure. We've seen a restriction or thinning of the blood supply, and again we see airway inflammation produces immunologic responses and the exacerbation of atherosclerosis. And I'm assuming everybody knows atherosclerosis. If not, we'll just call it cardiovascular disease. Now, I'm changing subjects. Here's elemental carbon, which is a surrogate for diesel. And let me just say, this is not a talk about freeways, but I'm going to just use it for a second, because elemental carbon is a surrogate for diesel, and diesel contains 90% ultrafine particles. Make no mistake about it. What you're seeing here is 12 cities throughout the South Coast Basin, and what you see is that as the elemental carbon goes up, the amount of air that one can breathe out goes down. And so, the percent of people with FEV1 less than 80% goes up. So that what you're seeing is on the far right side is people whose lung function is impaired. And that's a diesel exhaust response, but again, what we see with diesel is the same thing in terms of the particle size. In fact, the aircraft particle size is even smaller. Next slide. Now I want to mention, these are kids that we were studying, and if you look at the kids who've had reduced lung development, they have reduced lung development because of their exposure to particles and vapors, and that if you see that the kids who've been exposed to particles and vapors, their lungs haven't grown. And the point I want to make here is that puts them at risk of cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease and mortality throughout their lifetimes. This is not just a children's disorder, although it's a major disorder, as you well know. But the point I want to make is that this is a lifetime effect. If your lungs don't grow by the time you're 20, you're going to have the consequences of a reduced lung function throughout your lifespan.